All right, welcome everyone to another edition of the Forecast Contest. We're going to do our Friday edition today. We've got special guest Mark Russo from Riskpulse. I'm going to let Mark introduce himself, but Mark is a returning champion. Mark's been here several times, so we're happy to have Mark back. And Mark's going to, in just a few minutes here, he's going to walk us through his forecast and his forecast process. So I think that'll be a good experience for folks, especially who are trying to learn how to make medium range forecasts. But before we get into that, our agenda for today, we'll start with the attribution. So we'll look at the most recent verifications. We can also look at just the cooling season to date. We've got some of those metrics up here. And then we'll dive into the forecast. And again, we'll lead off with Mark. And then for others on the call, we'll welcome your contributions too. All right, so I'm going to kick it off, but guys, feel free to jump in here, Mark, Dave, anyone with comments on the past few weeks. And let me just preface this by saying, and I think anyone who's been loosely following the forecast, or just who has walked outside and lives in the continental United States, knows we are on track for a pretty hot summer, nationally speaking. Anyway, I cheated before this call. I was looking at some of the Maxar numbers, thanks to our sponsor there, Maxar, and the June-July period and the July period are on track to be the warmest on record since 1950. So yeah, this has definitely been a hot period, and I think that's going to be a big point of discussion here. In fact, I'll also see this too, just to give a fair warning for Mark. This probably be a question. We had a question from one of our students last week, Philip Ye. Actually, you're familiar with. And he was talking to me offline a little bit about persistence and, how do you handle situations like this? How do you handle persistence? What do you do? What do forecasters do? How do you bake it in? Do you ignore it? All this kind of stuff. When you're in a pattern that feels like it's going to last forever, what's the process? And every forecaster might have a different thing. So I'm just going to see that now. We'll spend, I'm sure, a lot of time on that as we get into the forecast. All right, but looking at attribution. So our most recent verification is the forecasts that were made on, I think this is right, from June 16th, and that verified July 1st to July 5th. So this is our most recent verification period. The verification for this period, this is national CDDs, this is the Maxar formula, was 63.3 CDDs. So that's pretty high. Just a benchmark here, we've got our 10-year, which is 56.7, and the 30-year normal at 50. So we were certainly well above those. Looking at the performance here, so I've already done this. I'll do it again. I'm going to sort this by CRPS. That's one of the performance metrics that we use in the forecast contest. Higher scores are better. So leading the way this time, actually, this might be the first time in a long while, and it was just by a slight margin, but the ECMWF actually had the highest ranked score here. And the CRPS looks at both the forecast mean and the spread. So the bottom line is, the closer the mean is to the forecast, the better you're going to do. And that, along with the less spread you have, the more you're going to be rewarded. The higher the spread, less reward, because your forecast, that mean is sort of distributed over a greater value. So ECMWF almost nailed it at 63.1. You can see it was just off by 0.2 and a decent spread. Industry one, that's Maxar actually. They also did quite well in this period. Matt Lanza also did quite well in this period. Looking at the other side of things, we've got the, I feel like I say this every week, but literally, the CFS was the only performer that had a negative score. The negative scores suggest or show that scores that are worse or less than the 30-year normal. So everything's benchmarked to the 30-year normal. So the CFS was the only forecast that did worse than the 30-year normal, because you can see that the 30-year normal was about 50 and the CFS was actually colder, lower in terms of CDD. So the CFS, that's something we can look at when we get into we'll look at the season to date, but the CFS has really struggled. I always like to show folks the map here too. So let's look at the map. So again, thanks to this is the what I said, July 1st, July 5th period. So I already pulled this up earlier. This is the Dynacast tool. So these are, you can see the temperature anomalies here. And of course, since this is sort of population cooling demand, you know, you kind of look at the big population centers, and, you know, that tends to be the eastern 2/3 of the country. And most of the eastern 2/3 of the country is way above normal hot, right? Chicago, New York, all these places, the only exception being the Pac Northwest, which doesn't, in terms of this forecast metric, uh, you know, carry a lot of weight. In terms of where this period ranked since 1950, it was this number fourth hottest. So one of the hottest periods on record. You see, 2012 looks like was the hottest at 72, and, you know, we came in at around 63. And as we talked about earlier, there's the 10 and 30-year benchmarks. Let's take one other look here, and then I want to open it up here to more folks. Let's just take a look at the hemispheric view. So yeah, this is still the July 1st to July 5th period. This is looking at the hemispheric view of things, the 500 millibar hemispheric view. So there you see that big honking ridge in the eastern half of the country. That ridge extended well up into Canada, into really over the North Pole. You see another ridge over Gulf of Alaska, trough over Europe, another trough there. It looks like over Eastern Asia. This might be a good question, time to really open it up. Mark, you could take this wherever you want, but I'm just curious, when you look at this 500 millibar pattern that was is associated with this hot pattern, at least up to this period, does this telegraph to you as what might be a typical kind of 500 pattern look to to hot periods, or is there anything sort of unusual about this, the fact that it was associated with such a hot period?
Yeah, Dave. To me, it is quite not highly unusual, but what is most unusual with this pattern is just the high amplitude nature of it, which is certainly something that we've seen an increased frequency of late here in recent, well, not only summers but also during the winter as well. Um, at times in the past with some of these heat waves in July or during the summer modes, you tend to have you have your above normal heights over the Midwest and on into the Northeast, and you typically tend to have a trough there over northern or northeastern Canada, like over Hudson Bay, and then you have like a good speed max. And so this, at least for the first 5 days of July, this is a bit more unusual in that you really didn't have that. You had your stronger troughing elsewhere, likely teleconnecting with that high amplitude ridge over Canada, which then crosses the pole and kind of head towards Siberia there on the other side. And then that's kind of flanked by the trough over Scandinavia and then over far eastern Siberia. So yeah, a bit of an unusual pattern. But one other thing to add there is that, from a temperature, well, from an anomaly standpoint, obviously we had the anomalies further up north. But I think also is one of these situations with this month's heat so far, and we think we're likely going to see that a lot throughout the rest of this month and probably in August as well, is that minimum temperatures are elevated. A lot of that is due to combination of what have been wetter springs, a wetter spring in portions of the central and eastern U.S., although that's dried out a bit of late, and then the warm SSTs surrounding much of North America as well.
That's a really good point too that Mark brings up. We don't talk a lot about in the forecast contest, but when you look at temperature, we normally talk in temperature anomalies, which is obviously a function of mins and highs and everything in between. And I think I think as Mark kind of alluded to, I think there's been a lot of research that suggests that with the hotter summers and stuff, it's actually been driven in a lot of areas more by the min temperatures than the max temperatures. So that's for anyone who's interested in that sort of body of research, climate change and shifts and stuff like that. You have to look at the whole picture, the mins and the maxes. It doesn't necessarily move in the in the same way in every area. Um, all right, thanks, Mark. And let's take a look here at the cooling season to date. So we've got up to 7 forecasts now. This started back in these are verifications since May. So anything that forecasts that I'm sorry, any forecasts that have been made since May. So we've got up to 7 forecasts here. Let's look. So we've got a couple different categories. Directionally correct. Directionally correct means on the right side of the 30-year normal. And then we've got our performance metrics. So when we look at directionally correct, that's one of my favorite metrics. So I'm going to just start there, but we can look at these others. There's no human performer that's 7 out of 7. The best we have, there's a few of us who are, I think, 6 out of 7 or 5 out of 6, but no one is 7 out of 7. You can see that up top. The couple folks like Stephen Decker, Professor Decker, he's 2 for 2, which is good, but no one's 7 for 7. I think there was one that threw us for a loop here. And then there's the CFS. The CFS, what is that? Who's a mathematician? I think that's 1 out of 7. In terms of directionally correct at 14%. So that's not good. The EC there is at 57%. And actually, if you go down to the sandbox, our sandbox includes a slightly longer list of forecast inputs that we don't use quite as much. But I did want to bring this up. The MGO, our little MGO analog input, which is an objective metric. It's basically an empirical sort of objective MGO. Basically says where's the MGO today, where's it initialized today, and then it creates sort of an ensemble of historical analogs 16 to 20 days out based on that initialization. And for what it's worth, it's 7 out of 7 so far in terms of getting the direction correct. So that's the only real input that's been 7 for 7. In terms of looking at our this is the CRPS. Yeah, some of our students are doing quite well here. I think Sean's on the line, Sean Parker, who's now contributed 5 forecasts, which I think meets our criteria, right? 5 out of 7. So he's done quite well. Philip Ye, he's probably going to jump on the line later. He and Mark, Philip, I think he's done some work with you guys. He's doing quite well there too. So the CFS there again at the bottom. Doesn't matter what metric you look at, the CFS is near the bottom. And let's look at the bias too here real quick to see if anything stands out. I'll sort it. I guess this won't surprise anyone. The CFS has a -11 bias. So again, in the cooling season, that means that it's too cool, right? So higher CDs, higher temperatures. So in the 7 forecast here, the CFS has had a 11 CDD cold bias, -11. So that's something to factor in if for anyone who is still weighting the CFS. You obviously may want to take that into consideration if you do weight it, if you do include it in your weighting scheme, to at least think about applying a bias correction to it. And one last thing, I like to look at performance versus consensus. So as opposed to performance versus the 30-year normal, sometimes this could be a better metric. Because obviously some forecasts have a higher and lower level of difficulty. And kudos to Matt Rogers there. He's contributed 6 forecasts, and Matt Rogers has the highest performance relative to consensus, followed very closely by Matt Lanza, and the CFS comes in at the bottom. So those are just looking at things season to date. Anyone have any questions or insight on season to date in terms of and feel free to add metrics that aren't here, but that you feel are either doing a particularly good or bad job this summer? Yep. No thoughts? Okay. Well, this might be a good time to move on to the forecast. So I'm going to pull up today or the most recent forecast. So just to get everyone's bearings, these are forecasts that were made, issued, Tuesday morning, so July 7th. These forecasts issued. The target window was July 22nd to July 26th. So I sorted here by the forecast mean. So it looks like our range of forecast were from almost 75 on the high end to 56 or so on the low end. The normal, that's the 30-year normal was the coolest forecast here. Even the CFS was hotter. Um, and it looks like where's the 10 year? The 10 years at 62. It's worth noting here that the record, I won't even pull it up because I looked at this earlier, but the record high CDD for this period, record since 1950, is approximately 75. So just the EC 16 to 20 days out was basically forecasting a record within a half CDD. Um, and so, as we talked about at the beginning, I want to turn it over to Mark now to walk us through his forecast. Understanding, of course, that Mark didn't produce a forecast on Tuesday, so it'll be Mark's forecast process really as of today. But I don't think too much has changed, so I think we're in good shape. But Mark, I want to lead you with a question there. It's just occurred to me. Um, how often have you seen that? Because I can't recollect situations like this, but you've looked at this even more than I have. How often do you remember the EC predicting a near record type CDD or HDD event 16 to 20 days out?
It hasn't happened lately, that's for sure. Um, Off the top of my head, I would say that the last time something was kind of similar, although even back then it was just kind of brand new with the EC weeklies. That was back in 2012.
Okay. So not too often is yeah, not too often.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. I thought when I saw this, I'm like, that's 16 to 20 days out, so that's pretty phenomenal. But hey, Mark, would you like the screen or do you want me to keep it on my screen? What would be most helpful?
Um, I can share my screen here,
All right.
and walk through the few different things here. All right, let me share desktop one. Okay. All right. Everyone can see
Yep.
the screen. And again, we partner with Maxar, so using just some of the 500 millibar maps on their weather desk page here. Let's walk through actually towards the end. That's kind of well. Before getting into this, I should say before getting into the details, what I typically do is before kind of going through at least the 15-day forecast to then start leaning into the 16 to 25 day. I'll look at some of just the big picture macro variables, and I already talked a little bit about that, but from a from an MJO standpoint, looking to see what's going on there. Haven't seen today's data hasn't quite updated, but a few comments there on the MJO, and that was Dave. That was really interesting to see with your metric there and how well it's done. We don't calculate that specifically, but it just feels from a tropical forcing / MJO standpoint that it has done well. So it's kind of neat to see that quantified. But typically when you have your tropical forcing there more centered in the Indian Ocean, and there's been some variations in that, western versus eastern, then that's more of a La Nina based state or more kind of mid latitude ridging. And tropical forcing's been pretty stuck here of late in the Indian Ocean. We're also seeing the Indian monsoon here kick in over the past 6 weeks or so. And for today, looking ahead, and there's been some model volatility in this, is that things look to be easing towards phase 3, which is historically one of your even warmest modes for the central and eastern US. And it seems like we're starting to go that way, although there still is debate. But if we go into the 16 to 25 day period with that phase 3, to us that points in the warmer than normal direction for much of the central and eastern US, which already we're in this warmer than normal pattern, but maintains that pattern, or like you mentioned there, Dave, about persistence. It's another signal that points towards persistence as we go through the remainder of July and even on into the start of August. So that's one kind of macro variable. And related to that, as kind of a second variable, is atmospheric angular momentum. And again, looking at the big picture here, in terms of what's been happening here of late. And I think that's been one of the key highlights starting out the summer cooling season, and that we've switched into a negative mode after earlier this spring in a positive mode. So with more negative tendencies, and now kind of solid negative phase of global atmospheric angular momentum, and at least for the next couple of weeks, a projection of it here. Although, if we actually take a look here at some of the CFS forecasts, longer term, and we've seen this before where things want to trend more positive with time. But like how I interpret atmospheric angular momentum here and the forecast is that certainly for the next 2 weeks, it's still a solid negative mode. So more mid to high latitude ridging from a big picture standpoint. And then longer term, I think that there is more of this positive bias seen in the CFS. So you do have to take these long-term projections with a grain of salt. But specifically for today's 16 to 25 day forecast, we feel that angular momentum will stay negative. As is always the case, there's some fluctuations there, maybe a little bit closer to zero, or maybe a little bit more or lower than -1. But the fact that we've gone into this negative mode going into the cooling season, and that's looking to stay that way. That's supported by this enhanced tropical forcing across the Indian Ocean, which also again points towards this more ridging and more heat persisting across the central and eastern US. Before moving on to any other details, any questions there? Or?
Mark, I do have one question for you. I did my homework and I read your the Riskpulse report today, and I read the 16 to 20 in particular, and I thought when I read it, you pointed to the MJO as a mixed signal, but and then I when you were just talking about it, it seemed like you were kind of looking at it more as a warm signal there. Did I Ca- did I miss something there, or what was your thinking there in terms of the
Yeah.
MJ?
Um, so I'd say as of right now, the fact that today, well, this is yesterday's data with the EC, but models have been projecting kind of 2 to 3 phase, which is mixed to warm leaning. We think that the probabilities are highest for warmer than normal temperatures when you're solidly in a phase 3. So especially like the eastern Midwest or like Great Lakes to the northeast. So just from a pure tropical forcing standpoint, we think that the signal will trend warmer with time, but as of right now, it's mixed to warm leaning. But I guess what I was commenting earlier here was just more so kind of just big picture. When you tend to have more Indian Ocean forcing, you tend to have that warmer well, mixed to warmer bias, but it's certainly stronger when you're in a phase 3 versus like a phase 2.
Got it. Thank you.
So, and I think also one other thing to add is that with the, at least from a pure model guidance standpoint, there has been some volatility in the MGO projections, and this dates back now over the past week or so, because we've kind of been stuck, and then there's been a few runs that are starting to show a little bit more progression, starting out the week 3 forecast, but then they've backed off. Right now, it's looking again that maybe start easing towards phase 3, but we have to see that, I have to see that roll forward here, at least to provide more conviction there that, okay, we're certainly going the route of a phase 3 MJO, which would be an even, warmer signal here for the Eastern US.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, and then one other, well, this starts to get into the details here. Want to go through not the Australia forecast. We don't think there's any teleconnection, at least as of right now, with Australia's weather. But let's want to take a look at, this is our Temperist product, and just again, this is one of the key components in our 16 to 25. And again, this starts to get into, and just for reference, again, there's a probabilistic temperature forecast that looks out 40 days. It's a combination of both dynamical model guidance, including the latest European weeklies, but then also a statistical model that is based on pattern recognition and looking back historically when in a similar pattern as what's been taking place in recent days, and then kind of projecting of like pathways of how temperatures then will be here with time over the next 5 to 6 weeks. So currently in our days 16 to 20, and below in this table, here's a breakdown of, like, here's the latest European weeklies, which is really that's the strongest warm signal out there. And whether that's, again, dynamical model guidance or even like on our statistical model, it's even much warmer than the statistical model side of things. Is showing is 68% in the statistical model versus a 90% chance of warmer than normal temperatures during that at least today's 16 to 20, the July 25th through the 29th time frame. As we go into days 21 to 25, you see the statistical model actually warmed up a little bit, the EC backed down a little bit. Some of that is progression of the pattern, but the two signals to us are in pretty good agreement. And for that whole time frame of day 16 to 25, I didn't see anything that much different here in terms of changes that warranted at least changing our skew for that day 16 to 25. Now, just like specifically, we in our day 16 to 25, we have more of a forecast leaning versus a like pure CDD forecast at that time. But again, from a forecast skew, we're pretty much at the highest levels and have been in the highest probabilities for that 16 to 25 day forecast. We're currently at 75% warmer than normal across the Midwest and kind of Eastern U.S. population zone. It's been that way over the past week or so, and that's also been the highest stretch of highest probabilities for warmth really this cooling season. And that started to take place, or that warming trend started to take place at the end of June, but really starting, I guess, early last week, we raised our levels raised our probabilities to the highest levels, and have maintained those basically over the past week plus. And a lot of this, not just from a signal standpoint, but from a pattern standpoint. And wanted to just to show here when talking about with the upper level pattern and the projection for the more expansive ridging taking place. And again, the signals that I see in terms of the upper level pattern, again, tropical forcing, this negative angular momentum base state, and then also from a soil moisture standpoint, things are starting to dry out in portions of the central U.S. as well. To us, that points towards persistence of kind of what we're currently seeing, in that maintaining warmer than normal temperatures, as we get into that day 16 to 25, and even potentially beyond as well.
Hey, Mark, can you talk a little bit about persistence? I remember, right? Yeah, I remember the slogan you and John sometimes would put in your reports: "Persistence is king." Um, how how does it weigh in a situation like this into your forecast process, where it feels like it's going to last forever, but like beyond the feel, because we've gotten these questions from a couple of the I mentioned forecast participants in terms of, hey, should I be waiting persistence? If I should be waiting persistence, how should I wait persistence? And I know it's not an easy problem, right? But how do you deal with that? And because I'm guessing too, from and just putting your your with your clients and stuff, I'm guessing you get that too, right? Like you get a client who says, "Hey man, hey Mark, it just why not, it's going to last forever. It feels like it's going to last forever." Yeah, I guess from a communication standpoint too, I guess it's a slightly different question. So two questions: how do you deal with that too when folks ask you this kind of questions and press you just to go hot forever? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, great questions. And we've been getting those questions, especially over the past couple of weeks. And it almost feels, just from a market standpoint, I guess more so energy, like, we work with ag as well, and now we're in really sensitive time frames, and a lot of the focus is on the next 2 weeks. But even with that, we're starting to get August forecasts as well. And I guess how we deal with that in well, number one is that with that, when that question comes in, we have to be armed with information here to provide reliable responses to our customers. And so one way we do that is just simply running some metrics on cooling degree days, kind of month to month analysis, or correlations between months of cooling degree days. And so as you go through the season, and again, this is something that we've been doing for a long time. Dave, you're well aware of this. That with this persistence here, taking a look at CDDs, monthly CDDs, and correlating with different months of the year. And so from a cooling degree day standpoint, we're entering the heart of summer. And just from a analysis standpoint, you go from July to August, that is one of the more persistent months, or persistent 2-month time frames of the entire season, where that correlation of CDDs is highest, meaning that if you have an above normal total CDD total during July, that it's a greater than 50% chance that that's also going to be the case during August. And then vice versa too: cooler than normal July, cooler than normal August. Again, it's not a perfect correlation. And I guess that leads kind of into the second question, or related to that, is that what could change that. And how do you communicate that? What are the risks that persistence doesn't remain king? and you have a total flip of the pattern or a significant change that really then drives the market in a different direction, and ultimately a major forecast change or major pattern change that which is having significant implications there. And so that's where I think you turn to the big picture variables, again, watching tropical forcing, angular momentum, even individual tropical cyclones, especially in areas of the Western Pacific. And sure many individuals here are listening in with the relationship, know about the relationship between recurving typhoons in the Western Pacific and how that could alter, or how that alters the North Pac jet stream pattern, which then eventually impacts our pattern here across North America. And so you kind of have the big picture base state, and but then within that you can have like individual synaptic features like tropical cyclones that can also prevent a risk. And certainly something that we're watching closely here as to persistence of the pattern. We do feel that and mentioned earlier that this current pattern we think will be sticking around for a while, late this month and likely into the start of August. But what could start to change that is that if the Western Pacific starts to turn more active from a tropical cyclone standpoint, or even here, if you start to see the Atlantic heat back up again, and not like just a tropical storm Faye, which is having a little bit of cooling demand destruction here the next couple of days, but do you start to have more African waves developing and then either staying out in the Atlantic, or either moving towards or near the East Coast or into the Gulf of Mexico? And again, are those progressing further up north to begin disrupting the jet stream flow, which then could have some longer term ramifications?
That's really good, and I definitely I know there's a few students on the line. I want to give them a chance, especially I know Philip jumped on, and this is one of his questions about persistence. But I just want to quickly follow up on that. So so Mark, again, I know these are tough questions, but so like in your experience, when you've been in situations where June, July has been super hot and stuff, and there's been those instances maybe where the pattern has, if not flipped, just underachieved in August, if you will, like cooled off somewhat. In your, I think you said this, but I just want to dive into it a little bit. Like those triggers for that change is tropical cyclones, like a recurving cyclone, or I guess in the Pacific, but also just a really strong hurricane maybe coming into the eastern half of the country, disturbing the jet stream. Is that what would you say are the top 1, 2, 3 kind of trigger mechanisms for changing the pattern from what it's been, like a really hot pattern in June, July, to something that's not as hot in August?
Yeah, number one is definitely tropical cyclones,
Okay.
both in the Pacific and then also in the Atlantic as well. And then related to that, again, how the tropical cyclones impact, well, I guess not only the jet stream, but also just the Arctic pattern as well. And watching what happens with higher latitude, either ridges or troughs, i.e. blocking patterns. Do those tropical cyclones start to impact that? Which again, you can have the two related, or it can be separate, and you have just changes in the Arctic. Your higher latitude ridges and troughs start to move around into an orientation, which then eventually starts to change the mid latitude jet stream pattern. And if we start to see, lately we've seen more kind of troughing in and around Greenland. If we were to start seeing more ridging of high pressure building across the North Atlantic on into Greenland, we think that would then potentially start changing things from a persistence standpoint. And it's not just Greenland, obviously the North Pacific as well. But those patterns have been also, pretty variable. I mean, I'm sorry, been pretty stable. If they start to become more variable, that would be a signal to us that, hey, things could be changing here down the road.
Right. Right. Well, thank you. For some of the students on the line here, before we maybe it looks like we have about 12 minutes left, so we can go into a couple of your forecasts here too. But before we do that, any questions for Mark? Not at the moment.
I guess
No?
the comment is, I think someone pointed this out that right now the West Pacific looks like a complete deathbed for tropical cyclones. So I guess at least my thinking is that probably has a factor on the pattern that's going on right now.
Yeah, absolutely, totally agree with that, Philip. And hey, Philip, how you doing?
Hey.
Yeah, that's all your enhanced convective activity, not necessarily tropical cyclones, but it's really been the Indian Ocean and portions of Africa as well, and Western Pacific has been dead, and well, we think that is related to this more kind of negative angular momentum base state, more of a La Nina global base state, which tends to reduce tropical cyclone development in the Western Pacific.
Yeah. There's that's a potentially interesting study too. I remember I haven't looked at this in a while, but just looking at the correlation in June-ish between activity out there in the tropical Northwest Pacific, activity in terms of count or ACE or whatever, and then the summers, CDD summers in the eastern half of the country. And I remember looking at that a little bit, and there were some interesting things for. So if anyone's feeling ambitious and has some time, uh, that's something that could be interesting to look into. But we have okay, so we have a few minutes here. I think it'd be great if one of the participants on the line wants to do. Mark, we started something we kind of call like the 2-minute drill, where we're going to flip the script here a little bit and say Philip or Michael or one of the participants you'll be the client per se, and they've got 2 minutes because you're in a hurry and you don't have a lot of time to waste. They'll give you a 2-minute recap of the forecast, and you and also anyone else on the line can feel free to drill into that and ask some hard questions. We're going to put you in the position of the jerky client, and so yeah, so it should be fun. So who would like to go? Who would like to go first?
I'll go first.
Is that you,
I go
Michael?
first. Yeah.
Okay. Would you like to share your screen, or do you want me to share mine?
You can share yours.
All right. Give me a second here. All right. So this is Michael. All right. So yeah, Michael, go ahead. Your 2-minute drill for Mark Russo. What does he need to know?
All right. So my forecast was for 73.5 CDDs with a slightly above average confidence spread of 5.4. Formula is same as it's been the past couple of weeks. So got to my value starting off with a base of 66.26 CDDs, and that's from the blend of the Euro and 10-year. Increased my CDDs by 2.2 based on at the time, negative NAO and PNA looking pattern, and then increased it by another 5 CDDs based off of the CPC showing one of the warmest forecasts I've ever seen from them the past year and a half, I think, showing most of the country with a 60% chance of above normal, including a lot of major population areas. And one other thing I'll mention is based on some of this data, there is the possibility of record-breaking heat during this period. And That's my forecast. Any comments, complaints, questions, concerns?
Great forecast. Just from a risk standpoint, if things were to lower, and I guess this starts to get more in like regional items, but if national CDDs were to lower, where do you think those lower CDDs would come from? Like what regions of the country or population weighted areas?
Um, I would say if there was any risk to that, I would say it would probably come from either the northwest, so the maybe Seattle could see a lowering a little bit, and possibly the north central. The only city that has a lot of population over there would be Minneapolis, maybe Twin Cities, a couple inlet in that area. I'm not sure it gets that far, but if there were any, but cool air coming in. But those would be my risk areas, northwest and north central.
Got it. Any reason why, or you didn't mention the Northeast at all? Why is that?
I didn't mention it specifically. Just to kind of save you some time. But yeah, I'm expecting New York, Boston, basically the I-95 corridor from Maine down to Florida to be above average.
With little risk then of temperatures cooling off, or the forecast
None that I could see
busting to
with
the
my
cooler side.
yeah, none that I could see with my with what I looked at.
Got it. Cool. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Michael. It's worth noting, I think Michael might have the warmest, hottest human forecast. Oh, no. That's Sean. That's Sean. Sean beat you by 0.2. Well, with that, maybe Sean, do you want to? I think you're on the line here. Do you want to give us your 2-minute drill?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you have to excuse me. I am actually in the car, so if I lose you for a second, I apologize. So for this week's forecast, I use the EC as a baseline. I've kind of been doing that for the past few forecasts. It was a pretty high one, but using negative AO and neutral NAO forecast, I felt like conditions were going to persist from last week's, and then, or from the week prior to this, and then with a neutral ENSO, and then a mixed reading on the MJO, but still nothing saying that there's going to be a lot of tropical forcing, keeping the pattern that is going from the week prior into this week. Looks like it's a strong possibility. And then soil moisture, I think, will come into play more in this week than it did the previous week, as more of the Midwest and central U.S. enters a higher drought area. There is a forecast for the East Coast to receive above average precipitation. So I think if there is a margin of error for possibility of cooler temperatures, that we'll see it more on the East Coast than in other regions of the country.
Interesting.
If you were to ask me where I think the possibility of cooler temperatures would be, that forecast.
Got it. Yep, that was my question. Same question.
I'm sorry I beat you to it, but I had a feeling it was coming.
No, that's good. No, this is great. Yeah. Oh, it's interesting. This is more of a comment, but you go back actually prior to the cooling season, or maybe the start of it in early May, in that the EC had a distinct cooler bias. You look back through this past winter, and it definitely had a cooler bias. Now we had one of the warmest winters of all time, so that's part of it. But even on into the spring, we saw that cooler bias continue. But that certainly now has flipped. And it's interesting. It's like, geez, if the European still had a cooler bias, oh my gosh, look out. It's already record setting. Is it even more here? So yeah, when it's done a very good job here of late. And so just from a pure dynamical model guidance standpoint, I think sticking with that, again, until you see enough evidence to change it or to kind of back away from what it's specifically showing, I think that's the right decision.
All right, very good. I think we have time for one more. Philip, do you want to walk us
Sure.
through your process?
All right. So my formula is largely unchanged from the previous few weeks, where I use 35% of the 10-year and 10% of the 20-year running mean sort of as a baseline that also takes into account the climate signal. So putting everything together, I have tropical convection focused mostly over Africa and Western Indian Ocean, which leaves the MJO roughly in phase 1 to 2, with not a very clear direction of where this signal will propagate, possibly even entering a null phase. And using both the lag composites and also our MJO analog values, I got the tropical signal to be a fairly warm signal, and ENSO conditions remained near neutral for now. CPC, as was mentioned, has warmth over the entire CONUS, and I noticed that the CPC cited dynamical guidance and low soil moisture as their supports. And then looking at the teleconnections, we have the AO and NAO both forecast to be slightly negative or near neutral, and using our July patterns that suggest that we're expecting warm conditions. And then the PNA EPO may be slightly negative. So putting everything together, the teleconnections was a weak but possibly slightly warm signal. And then finally, as we saw, the EC is forecasting near record warmth. And the CFS also has a ridge, but leaves the ridge farther north in the and the signs of a trough in the deep south as opposed to the ridge on the EC. So putting everything together, I get to my value of 64.8, which I then add 2 CDDs as my fudge factor, and confidence was treated slightly above average given the high confidence of warmth from all the variables.
Great. Guess I'll ask you also the similar question: if things were to shift cooler, where do you think most likely that would be across the CONUS?
I think I would say probably the deep south along Florida to about Louisiana, that area. If one, they get a lot more precipitation, especially what the EC I think is hinting at. And the other is if the ridge that the EC forecast to be over the entire CONUS ends up shifting a little north, so that you actually get some troughing over the northern Gulf area, I think that would be the cooler concern.
Interesting. Cool. Thank you.
Well, that was perfect timing. That brings us to about an hour. So, Mark, we don't want to keep you too much here, but thank you so much for contributing here and walking us through your forecast process and also providing feedback for the our forecast contestants. I think that was great.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you for the invitation to be a guest here. This has been great.
All right. Well, hopefully we can all do this again soon, and we'll look back at this summer and see what kind of August we ended up getting. Did we get the one? Did we just get the persistence is king, or did we get the flying the ointment tropical, hurricane or cyclone up the gut that rearranges the pattern? Stay tuned, right?
Exactly.
All right. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
you too.
Bye, guys.
Bye.